have you ever been in a protest before, or have you seen one?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. I have been to protests when I was younger, absolutely. Um, been to quite a few marches as well, like where you march for stuff, which is like, I suppose, a form of a protest. Um, I haven't done it in years though. Like it's yeah, literally moments in my childhood. I've got memories of going to protests and participating in marches for certain things. What about you?
So I haven't been a part of a protest, but I got caught up in one. I was living in Chile a couple of years ago, and right before the pandemic, Chile was having problems with protesting because recently their government changed some laws or some rules, and because of these new rules in place, the prices of many things went up, like transportation, food, things that were mostly affecting poorer people, and they just got really pissed off about it, and they went to the streets. I was living in Valparaiso. Valparaiso is like this beach port town, about an hour and a half east of Santiago, the capital of Chile. And right next to there is Viña del Mar. It's like a hot spot for Chileans to go on their summer vacation because it's not, and they don't always have nice weather by the beach there. But during the summer, it's usually pretty good, and it's like decent for surfing. Anyways, I was living there, and the protest started, and the street I was living on was one of the streets being affected by the protests. People would be starting fires at intersections with whatever they could find to light on fire, looting, um, smashing like businesses. A lot of businesses had to close up and bounce. There was always smoke in the neighborhood that was it's like a tear gas, I believe, and there was always tear gas in my neighborhood. But I mean, it's just weird what humans can get used to, right? Because I would still continue leaving and going to the gym, and sometimes I'd be working out in tear gas. Like they would throw it, and then it would just start filling up the street, and it would come into the gym, and everybody that was training was like, and like it was horrible. I don't know if you've ever experienced tear gas, but it's terrible. This one day, it got really bad, and I was leaving at night, and every corner had a fire. Police are going by in these armored vehicles that I've never seen before. Like I haven't seen them in a movie or anything. They looked like a I don't know how to explain it. Much older and much more just different. Like just something I can't. It wasn't like a tank, but it was like in between like an armored truck and a tank. If there's something in between those, I don't believe it had weapons though. And I just remember feeling like I was in what's that movie, The Purge or something. It was really strange, and you just get used to it. You know what I mean? You see, and it became like a daily thing where I'd be seeing this shit. And sorry, so the one day I'm going back to my house, and I see that the police have made like this blockage on this huge area. And the way Valparaiso's set up is that many streets from where I was living in my neighborhood are against like this, like basically on a mountain, right? So to go to go around them, the blockade, you have to go up the mountain, right? And um, because of my curiosity, I kind of wanted to see, what was going on. So I'm getting closer, and I'm getting kind of scared now because there's so much smoke. There's people throwing rocks at the police. The police have their like shields and their body armor on, and they're armed and everything else. Um, and this one guy noticed that I wasn't part of the protest, because I was kind of just like scared, like a deer in the headlights sort of thing. And he ran up to me. He's like, "Yo, dude, like, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going home, but I have to go through the blockade." Like, all right, yo, come with me, follow me. And he basically took me by my hand and we went for a run, like towards the blockade. And I was like, yo, like this is so fucked up. And we got close and the police are just like just staring at us. And I'm just like, yo, I just need to get through. Can you please let me through? I need to get to my house. And then like a bunch of cops just like moved over without saying anything and let me through. And I remember feeling like a little bit crazy, but also it was somewhat like a new normal for me. Yeah, strange experience.
That is. So what you just hit on though is a very interesting phenomena that emerges, which is we get so accustomed to our surroundings, our environments, to things happening over time that they become our new normal. Right, so it's not normal to start with, but if you live with it for long enough and it's part of the daily routine, or becomes just your regular, that is your new normal. So like our normal is so it's so adjustable. It can be augmented in any which way, if that kind of makes sense.
Do you mind sharing some of the protests or walks that you went to, that you participated in?
Yeah. Oh, geez, it's a long time ago. A big one that I remember was to do with, I don't know, early on in the sort of, I don't know, LGBTQ kind of movement. So I grew up in an area in Sydney, Australia, like Darlinghurst, King's Cross sort of area. So my parents were involved in businesses around that area as well, etc. And so there's a big LGBTQ community there. And so one of the early sort of marches or protests was to do with, equal, what is it? Equal rights for marriage. So like gay marriage and things like that, and trying to have all those sorts of things approved and make them less frowned upon. And that would have been in the early 2000s, I believe. So that was a notable one I remember. What was another one? I remember going to some with my mom, but I was so young that I can't even really remember the purpose or the premise. But yeah, the LGBTQ ones, there was a few of those to participate in that.
Okay, interesting. Do you agree that a lot of times the media tries to put a certain spin on protests and make the protesters look crazy, by showing people that seem kind of crazy? And sometimes you even see people interviewing people at the protests, but they obviously pick and choose which ones they show, and they end up showing people saying ridiculous shit or stupid shit, or the interviewers trying to make the person protesting look stupid. Do you find that that's what the case is?
I'm sure that would be the case. But I don't watch a huge amount of the thing, so I can't necessarily comment on the whole of it. But I'm sure that would be the case, purely because that would generate more views. So if you're going to present very extreme or polarizing, snippets of things, it's going to get more engagement than just like a vanilla version of it. Finding those extremities is going to pique people's interest, which is going to keep them engaged or get them to view your content. So yeah, I can absolutely, and it's to me, it's sort of the nature of the beast, right? Like they're vying for attention, so then they have to try and do the things that will get the most attention, and sampling the people that have very extreme views and showing them to people is going to get people more sort of intrigued in their content, I suppose.
Did you ever feel when you were protesting that you were making a difference?
My experience is from a very young age. So yeah, at that point in time, I genuinely felt like I was contributing to it. And then there's obviously some sort of, confirmation bias in there as well, because I was around other people who, reinforced me feeling that, they were all there doing that same thing. They all seemed to be really happy and enjoying themselves. And it was very, obviously a very colorful crowd, right? For the LGBTQ community. So it was a very colorful crowd. Everybody seemed to be having a lot of fun. Everyone was, enjoying themselves, and it was more like a a sort of street festival, I suppose, than it was, a protest. And so it was that's my sort of experience with it. I've seen protests that were not that, but I haven't participated in them. I've seen them. I've been very close to them. But yeah, I definitely felt like I was making a difference. Definitely helped, and also because of my upbringing, I sort of thought that these things, what we were protesting for, or what contributing towards, should be the case. Like, it shouldn't be different. It should be how everyone's protesting for it to be. So I felt right. I'm sure everybody else there felt that they were right, and so we felt like you feel as if you're fighting the good fight, so to speak.
Welcome back to Idiots Squared, definitely the most open-minded podcast in the world, where two complete idiots are just trying to figure out what this shit's all about. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment. Make sure to comment. We really appreciate the comments. And if you want to talk shit, go ahead. Talk shit. You are free to do so.
Correct. And if you fuck around, you'll find out. Just remember, you got to fuck around though, otherwise you'll never find out.
That's true.
Right, so, this one, I just stole it off a meme. This pod is predominantly going to be about protesting, right? Well, that's one of the topics, but I think the more sort of meta principle there is free speech, your ability to express yourself freely, and I think that under free speech, protests sort of fall under that banner as well. And so, is anything you'd like to do to intro, Guy?
I asked ChatGPT some questions, and one of the questions I asked, I thought gave an interesting answer. Let me just find it. Can protesting lead to less freedom? So this is from ChatGPT, so take it for what you will.
So you asked it, can protesting lead to less freedom?
Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, cool question.
In some cases, protesting can lead to restrictions on freedom, although this is not always the case. Governments may sometimes respond to protests by enacting laws or policies that restrict the right to free speech or assembly, or by increasing surveillance or other forms of control over citizens. In some cases, protests may even lead to violent crackdowns or other forms of repression. However, it is important to note that restrictions on freedom in response to protests are not inevitable. So, can you clear that up for me? I'm not really sure what that means, because it says it is important to note that restrictions on freedom in response to protests are not inevitable. What would that mean, not inevitable?
So what it means is that just because you're protesting doesn't mean the government's going to crack down on protests.
Oh, okay.
Right? Like, if it was inevitable, then anytime anyone protests, that would mean that they would crack down on it.
Yeah. And
so it's just saying it isn't inevitable, which means that some protests lead to really good things happening. Yeah. Other protests, though, like if people are sort of taking the piss with their protests, like their protests are actually creating problems, then the government might be justified, or they might think they're justified in cracking down on protests, right? So imagine if you lived in a country or a city where every week people just got together and protested, random shit, and they, screwed up the workings of the city, or they inhibited people's quality of lives in that city just because they're protesting these sort of arbitrary things. Well, then a government might feel as if might feel justified to then sort of impose restrictions on protesting to stop that from happening. And that's a case where it could lead to that. And then ChatGPT's statement saying that it's not inevitable is essentially it saying that, well, just because you protest doesn't mean that people are going to crack down on your protests. That's how I interpret it, but I could be wrong.
Okay. No, I couldn't understand it, because it was like I never seen not inevitable. Usually you read something and it says inevitable, but not inevitable. For some reason, well, because I'm an idiot, I haven't seen that before. And many protests have been successful in bringing about positive social and political change without resulting in a loss of freedom. Additionally, even in cases where protests have led to restrictions on freedom, they have often been followed up by subsequent efforts to restore and protect those freedoms. Ultimately, whether or not protests lead to less freedom depends on a variety of factors, including the nature of the protest, the response of those in power, and the broader political and social context in which the protest takes place. While there is always a risk that protesting may lead to restrictions on freedom, the benefits of exercising the right to free speech and assembly often outweigh these risks.
Correct. I would agree with that. So an example where is with the most recent COVID stuff, where COVID was a virus that could be spread through the transmission of aerosols, essentially, for breathing, just respirating, right? If you have the virus and it's in your lungs or in your throat, even in your mouth, and you're breathing, you're spreading virus particles, essentially. And so an interesting sort of thing happened with COVID, which was the governments and the people in power tried to minimize the protests around COVID, and they used that, well, you can infect and spread COVID by protesting. Okay, so that was one sort of rationale for why they were trying to restrict or prevent people or inhibit people's ability to protest about COVID and about vaccine mandates and all these other things. An interesting thing to consider there is that even given that there was still that risk and people essentially were aware of those risks, they still chose to go out and do it. And I think that kind of speaks to the matter of, like, if something's really, really important to you, you can choose to sacrifice some of your safety to sort of communicate that point or get that message across that you're really trying to share. But yeah, that was one example where governments tried to restrict people's ability to gather and protest. And they were using a justification of, well, it's dangerous because you might cause this pandemic to accelerate or increase the transmission of this virus.
Which is hilarious, because the point of the protest was to combat the very regulations that were put in place because of the virus. So it's like an interesting sort of dance that's going on there.
Yeah, so these are these sort of dualities that exist between so many different things.
So because I'm from Canada, I heard about what was going on a lot with the trucking protest. I know you've heard of the truckers protest, right? I'm pretty sure the whole world has. Yeah, I think we even talked about it before, I'm pretty sure. So here's an example where people feel as if their freedoms are being taken away from them. So what they did was they went downtown Ottawa, like trucks all over the country. I even believe trucks from the States came too.
Yep.
They essentially made a blockade of trucks around, I don't know if it was Parliament or it was a downtown area in Ottawa, basically where politicians are working. And they were there for a few weeks, I believe like 3 weeks or more, right?
I think more than 3 weeks.
Right. And it was a peaceful protest. Obviously, there was some attempt to make it seem like they were violent or racist or any sort of those go-to words that they use now. Oh, misogynists.
Yeah. Pick a key word. Pick a key word thrown at them.
Yeah. Which was not the case. I believe one of the biggest complaints from that protest was the noise, because they were always on their horns, and truck horns are pretty intense. They're pretty loud. And many of the residents in that area were complaining from the noise, right? So did the truckers cross a line of a peaceful protest because they were on their horns, or are they still within the realm of peacefulness, although that they were on their horns? Like, do you think that that's crossing the line anyway? What's your opinion on that?
I personally don't, but it didn't personally affect me. So, you know, my opinion isn't that valid, really. So it's so subjective, right? For some people, it will be because they will have been affected by it. But at the end of the day, I'm also like an accountability absolutist. Like I believe in taking accountability for my state and how I feel and how I choose to perceive things. And so if that was happening and that the truckers were, honking their horns continuously and it started to get to a point where I couldn't function because of that noise, I'd look for ways to minimize their ability to affect my state. So I'd buy, a set of headphones or a set of earmuffs, and like I would augment my environment or change things around me to manage that as best as I can. So yeah, I think that we all have a level of responsibility and accountability in these things, and we can take these things into our own hands and put certain measures in place to minimize, right, other people's ability to affect or negatively or positively affect us. Okay, so that's one. The other one was with the truckers' protest was they were just, I believe this was well, sorry, I read that this was why they were doing it, is they wanted to discuss the vaccine mandates and they wanted to discuss certain things with the politicians because it directly affected them. It was changing the way that their lives would have to be, and it was changing certain things to do with their lives, right? And this is a decent percentage of the population in Canada, and they're essentially, part of the lifeblood of Canada. Without trucking, things just don't get around, and so it's a very crucial part of the infrastructure. They play a key role. And so, honestly, the simplest way to have stopped those protests would have been for the government to actually sit down and talk with them. I believe that's all they wanted. And the only reason they were still there and still honking was because that was not happening. So, like that you can blame the truckers or you can blame the politicians. And I lean more towards like blaming the politicians for not sitting down and trying to resolve this with them.
From a very young age, we are taught again and again and again how important communication is. And when a governing body is not willing to even communicate, this is a really bad sign. So yeah, I agree. On one hand, you could say it's the fault of the politician for not even giving the opportunity to have some sort of sit down communication to discuss these policies, right? They just chose to ignore. And obviously, they knew that this was going to prolong the protests. To me, the protests would have kept going if they didn't enact the Emergencies Act. I bet you it still would have been going because I don't feel like communication was ever going to be warranted if it wasn't warranted after 3 weeks of time. So I think it's a fairly long time to be protesting and or no decisions or nothing to be advanced. Like nothing actually came out of that. What I found interesting was part of the Emergencies Act was actually, I don't know if this was part of it, but they also blocked numerous bank accounts that were associated with the truckers. So if you donated money, for example, to the cause, your bank account would get not shut down, but it would be blocked, like frozen. You wouldn't be able to do any activity. So you have no access to your money. You can't pay your bills. It's quite the predicament to be in. It's quite excessive for the government to do that. I think the whole Emergencies Act was quite excessive. The argument was, well, like you said, they're the bloodline of Canada, right? They're transporting all sorts of goods. So this was sort of looked at from the government's perspective as an attack on the economy, essentially, right? So obviously, during a protest, you need to make a statement. And the best way I feel to make a statement is to have a direct effect on the economy because the government is heavily, heavily reliant on the economy. The economy is everything in a country. So if you disrupt the economy in a country, I feel like that is a very quick way to get results. But look, it didn't actually get results. So
Well, it didn't
what
get the
is going
intended
on?
result. It did, yeah, it did get the intended results. I don't think. Well, I haven't followed it closely since it sort of fizzled out. Well, you said a really important thing. A good way to get attention and to get your point heard is to do something that directly affects whoever it is that's in charge or doing the thing that you're disagreeing with or that you think should be done differently, right? And that's essentially what they did. Now, you made a good point as well about they cut off the bank accounts. So I believe that happened after the Emergencies Act was engaged or they turned it on or they enacted it. So after it was enacted, they then were able to do these things. These were new powers that the government got in a short period, short term to go to extraordinary measures in extraordinary times. Right? That was their justification, which I think is largely bullshit because they could have just had a talk. And until you talked and tried to resolve it with these people, if you talked through everything and you couldn't get anywhere, then maybe enact the Emergencies Act, right? But not before. Like that's just stupid. You haven't exhausted all your resources. And so by them sort of doing this to the bank accounts and to the people that donated to them, right? They also targeted those people as well. Anyone that donated. I don't know if you remember, but there was a list of all the people that donated to the truckers that got publicly released. They call it doxing. They got doxed. Yeah, and so then people were getting death threats. People's businesses were getting vandalized because they supported the truckers. And so that's a form of starvation in a way. And so what you're doing is you're restricting that person or those people or that population of people. You're restricting their access to goods and services because money is the mechanism at which you get goods and services. Right? So they restrict that. And so they were trying to essentially or an analogy you can think of is fire can't burn without oxygen. So they were essentially cutting off the oxygen to the fire that they didn't want. And the money is the oxygen in that analogy. And so they did that and it worked to a degree, right? Now, all of those measures that the government took, in my opinion, were largely overdoing it, right? That was so far beyond what needed to actually what could have actually been done. They could have simply just tried to sit down and discuss this. But the reason I think that didn't happen is because the government thought that they were right. They weren't willing to be wrong. They thought they knew everything and they were fully justified in all of their reasoning. So they weren't willing to listen to anybody else. And the truckers were just proposing a different viewpoint, but the government refused to listen to their different viewpoint. Now, after the fact, we can see that their viewpoint was actually very valid and likely right and would have been very useful to listen to, but that didn't happen. And this is the problem when you think you're right and you're not willing to be wrong. So thinking you're right or knowing that you're right, so to speak, but not willing to be wrong is a very, very dangerous thing. It can lead to all of these, horrendous unintended consequences and usages of power that aren't warranted. It's very dangerous.
Within another question I asked ChatGPT, it says, research has shown that protests can be an effective way to bring about social and political change, particularly when they are peaceful, well organized, and have widespread public support. Protests can help to raise awareness of important issues, influence public opinion, and put pressure on decision makers to take action. However, the effectiveness of protests can also be limited if they are violent, disruptive, or lack public support. In some cases, protests may even backfire if they are seen as threatening or illegitimate by the public or those in power. Protests can be the most effective when they are combined with other forms of activism and advocacy, such as grassroots organizing, lobbying, and media campaigns. When used together, these strategies can help to build momentum for change and increase the likelihood of success. Overall, while protests are not a guaranteed way to bring about change, they can be a powerful tool for promoting social and political transformation when used strategically and in combination with other approaches.
Yeah, I agree. They are incredibly powerful. The the reason they're sort of powerful is because if you do them, like I said, peacefully, well organized, at sufficient scale with enough people, it's a fantastic way to get, the powers, or, the people in charge, to pay attention, because it's really hard to ignore a few million people standing outside your house, with signs. It's really, really difficult to ignore that. Whereas most other things in life, you can just look the other way, or you can focus on something different, and you can ignore most things, right? And it really is. Protests are a fantastic way to bring attention towards something. We can make an analogy between pain, right? So pain is not going to be controversial. Pain isn't a real thing in a sense, right? Pain is a mechanism to bring attention to somewhere in your body, right? And the reason it has to hurt is because if it didn't hurt, right, it wouldn't get your attention. You could easily just be like, oh, it's okay, or just brush over it. And so it wouldn't fundamentally work as a mechanism, right? Because you could just easily forget about it. So it has to be this crazy, ridiculous thing that's, sort of painful to bring your attention to it. And you can think of protests in a similar way, right? Like, things have to get sufficiently bad for people to start protesting. And then when they do start protesting, it's a form of bringing people's attention to a specific thing that's clearly affecting a population or is a big issue.
The part about lobbying and sort of trying to infiltrate the media seems like it would be very effective alongside of a peaceful protest, because if you can get politicians on your side or lobbyists on your side, that's probably the most effective strategy, in my opinion. A peaceful protest along politicians who also are backing up that change.
Yeah. Yes, that it is a key part of it. The problem is we can't say necessarily most important, because there's a whole chain of events that have to even lead to being able to get a politician to become aware of this, and then get the lobbying, et cetera. And there's incentives and all of these other things that we go across, but they all play a role, that is for sure. The interesting thing, specifically with that trucker one, is that it was a peaceful protest. They got huge amounts of attention, but then it was flipped to they tried to create a narrative, the media and whoever else was, trying to become divisive to get attention or to push a different narrative. They were able to manipulate what was happening on the ground, or take, small samples out of it, and then magnify them to make them look like they were worse, or they were something that they weren't, right? And tried to turn it into these truckers are doing this violent thing. They're doing this horrible thing. And they tried to spin it so that they lost credibility, because their message was actually valuable. It was a good message. They were doing an amazing thing. They got a lot of attention that became an international thing. There was all the hashtags and all the rest of it for the truckers around the world. And I think other truckers copied what they did and did it in different parts of the world. I know in Australia that group of truckers got together and did a similar sort of thing down to the capital of Australia as well. And in America it happened. So it was a very powerful movement. And so even though you are, largely the goal of the protest is to be peaceful, you will always have a subset of people that act outside those bounds. And then on top of that, if you have an interested party that they don't want your protest to succeed or get across the line, then they can pretend to be protesters and start doing things that are violent. They can start provoking bad behavior. They can start encouraging people to do things that aren't what the overall protest is about. And so that you can start to develop, a bad reputation for the protest, or you can start to create things that allow people to frame that protest as being a negative thing instead of a positive thing. And this is the age we live in. Signaling is so cheap in the modern age. Signaling something is so cheap. Actually, being able to see the substance of something is hard. We're so, I think the word might be, we're so obfuscated or abstracted away from the base reality. We live in this sort of, world where we just believe what that comes through the television. So that way people have cottoned onto that, and they know that they can take these little subsets of something that happened there, and they can turn them into these crazy other narratives and just pump that, and then that's what people think is really happening, when really it only makes up less than 0.1% of what's really happening there.
What happened with the truckers concerns me. In a way, it was a direct attack on free speech. And what concerns me is that moving forward, when Canadians have other issues, which they're not in agreement with, they're going to think twice about protesting. So one of the reasons for that is Pat King. He was one of the leaders of the truckers' protests. Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
So Pat King was put in jail, and I'm not sure if he's out yet. I don't know if you heard anything, but he might still be in jail for basically leading the protest. And because of the frozen accounts, like we mentioned, the Emergencies Act, these are fear tactics that are now in every Canadian's heart the next time someone or a group feels they want to go out and protest. So in my opinion, that is a direct attack on free speech. If you are making people fearful of free speech, then that is attacking free speech. What you should be doing is enabling people to have free speech. So that's what concerns me in Canada and other parts of the world. Especially, we're talking about a peaceful protest, like you said.
Yeah, I agree with you. And yes, that is a concerning thing. These are, big time concerning. So you're exactly right. It sets a precedent, and it does instill fear in people wanting to protest in the future. And a scary thing about all of that is that if you're on the side of the people, so say you're on the side of you align with the government in this case, and you think that the protesters were doing a harmful protest and all the rest of it, and what they were protesting was bullshit anyway, and it doesn't matter, and they're all wrong, right? You're going to be so happy that the government did what it did to stop those protests, okay? Until they don't agree with you. And then you're going to be really pissed, right? And so it's like, yeah, it's all well and good while they're on your side, but as soon as they're not, then it's going to be a hell for you. And so it's a very dangerous thing. And so I agree with you. We should be trying to sort of encourage people to, be free to speak, providing the space where people can be more free to speak, but not necessarily incentivizing people to protest, right? I think protest is like a last resort. Ideally, we don't even have protests, or we have very few protests. And not because we're trying to suppress the protests, but because we don't have that many giant issues that need protesting. Like if the certain things weren't mandated, if all of this, unnecessary constraint and regulation was put on the system, if we didn't put all of that there in the first place, then the protests would never have arisen, right? They arose because the measures that were being taken were ridiculous, were over the top, and they were encroaching on people's ability to live their lives and to have autonomy and to be free to choose what goes into their body or what they do with their body, right? Because those things were getting encroached upon or getting taken away from them, that's why they protested. They needed to, because they were losing freedoms. And that's what it feels like to lose degrees of freedom. It's horrible. It feels, like it's a horrible feeling. That's why they protested. So that can all be avoided by just not making these stupid freaking rules and regulations. Like it's just that simple. Elon Musk has a good sort of bit about this, about how like societies sort of tend to accumulate rules, and the rules continue accumulating rules until it gets to the point where the system is so bogged down with these ridiculous rules that nothing ever happens. And then that civilization typically dies, and then a new civilization starts up again, and they start with very few rules, and then they can iterate fast and grow fast, and so they tend to do better, and then the same thing will happen to them eventually. There's another famous Australian, Kerry Packer, and he's got some good YouTube clips when he was in court in Australia. They were trying to get him for tax fraud, and they asked him, you practice, dodging taxes and, avoiding the tax code and all the rest. He goes, no, sir, I actively practice tax minimization. And he goes, and if you don't, you're an idiot, really. Like, that's what you should be doing, is trying to minimize how much tax you pay. Anyway, really good point about that. But then he brings up another thing about Australia, saying the reason I practice that sort of tax minimization is because I don't want to be giving all that money to you people, the politicians, the government, because all you're doing with it is creating more and more ridiculous rules that inhibit anyone's ability to do anything. And now there's rules that you can't even understand. You need a degree to even try and understand what this rule really means. He says, I have a much better approach. We don't make any rules that can't be understood in a simple sentence. And Elon has a similar principle. We shouldn't have any rules more complex than a simple sentence. Like, if you need a degree to understand a rule or a law takes up multiple pages in a book, it's probably too ridiculous.
In Colombia, a similar thing happened in Chile. The government, again, I don't remember exactly what was put in place. However, poor people were going to be largely affected by some of these changes. Just prices of things just going up. A ridiculous amount of inflation suddenly. So in Colombia, they have this group called La Primera Línea in Cali. And La Primera Línea, that just means like the first line. They are a group of people from these really, really poor neighborhoods in Cali that basically give their life to try and protest and fight to get more rights, because in Colombia, there's a large gap between poor people and rich people. In Australia and in Canada, the gap is much smaller. However, in Colombia, it's really crazy. Like, there's some neighborhoods at the poor level that, I mean, you can't go to. They're no-go zones. The police doesn't go there either, right? So it's in people from these types of neighborhoods that are part of La Primera Línea.
Wow.
So it's beautiful that the poorest people are fighting for the rights for everyone, or to make positive changes for everyone. But people with money, they don't give a shit, because if they're not being that much affected. They are, like, things are becoming a little bit more expensive for them. But Colombians who have money, they're not going to be affected, right? So it's interesting to see how poor people group together and fight against the government. However, it largely leads to violence and many murders happening, many police officers dying, many Colombians dying, and they actually try and hide the fact from the world that this is happening, but it happened. It happened during the pandemic. I don't remember if it was before or during, early on in the pandemic, but many people died. Many young kids died fighting. Police officers died. It was crazy. There was a lot of destruction. And I'm kind of curious, and I want to hear what your thoughts are on why do many protests result to violence, like we see in Colombia and how I've seen in Chile?
Okay, so a bunch of things. One thing that you said there was that this the lower end of this sort of demographics, right? So the poorer are the ones on the front line, right? And you were like, it's interesting to see that they're the ones that get together, and the rich people, so to speak, don't really care, right? Part of that is what you said, which is that it doesn't necessarily directly affect them. Okay. The other part of it is when you have money, you don't need to resort to protesting. You can just pay people. Like, you can just lobby. You can buy someone off. You can do all sorts of different things, or you can just leave. Right? If you got enough money, you just leave, go somewhere else. So those problems aren't really, problems when you have a decent amount of money. Okay, so there's sort of like less of a need to protest at that because of the money you have, right? When you're lower on that social hierarchy, or in that lower demographic, or don't have as much money, and also possibly education as well, all you really have is getting together in numbers. And so, that's the tool that you have available. That's the space where you can actually do something, is get together in large numbers, disrupt something so that people pay attention to you, so they finally listen to you. Okay. But you've got to make them listen to you. They won't just listen to you because of the kindness of their heart, right? That doesn't typically happen. Ideally, it would, but it doesn't. Okay. Well, and not even ideally, right? Even that's a stupid thing, because ideally, if they listened to everyone that had a bleeding heart, everyone would just have a bleeding heart. So then they'd have to try and listen to everybody, and that's an impossible task. There's too many people in the world. You can't listen to everyone. So they get together in numbers to do these protests because that's all they really can do, right? They can't necessarily affect change greater than that. They can't, you have to have some sort of money to get educated, or you have to have some sort of degree of freedom to be able to become educated. That's going to take time and energy. And then even then, it's not guaranteed that you can create change. Whereas if you get enough people together, you've got the chance of creating some change relatively quickly. Okay, so that's the first sort of part. And then why do they tend to go towards violence? There's a whole bunch of stuff to go into. I think we probably avoid that for today, and we could do a whole nother thing on complex systems and critical masses and like emergent phenomena and sort of synchronization within groups, critical points and things like that, like flash points for fires, and like just before state transition. Sorry, so like you start to heat water up, and then at some point it'll just start to boil, and it changes state from liquid into a gas. All of these sorts of phenomena we can learn from them, and we can apply them to these sorts of large crowds of people or groups of people. Similar stuff sort of happens. But why do they typically go to violence? I don't know if it's typical that they do go to violence. I'm sure that there's some sort of bias in there that we might only be seeing the ones that do go to violence, and we don't see enough of the ones that don't. Okay, so I don't know definitively if that is the case. But why do some go towards violence? Well, when you get enough people together in a large group, part of them getting together is that they're obviously fed up with something, right? They're at a point where they're so frustrated, or they need to express themselves, that they're getting out to do it. Okay, so that's sort of creating a space. And then you get enough people together, and then you can have the wisdom of crowds, but you can also have the madness of crowds. And so when you're all in that, you're all sort of, by coming together in that large collective, you all start to oscillate. We spoke about this in the music ep, where you go to a festival and you all share a collective sort of vibrational state, right? And that can be a really euphoric thing. The same thing happens in protests, and they can be amazing. Like my experience with protests when I was a kid, they were positive. But you can also have the opposite of that. You can have the inverse. You can have a spectrum of it in between, where there could just be a lot of pent up anger and aggression because of the amount of oppression or pain that your community or the population of people has gone through. Okay, and so you're all sharing that vibe, and all it takes, right, if you're all oscillating on that one sort of frequency, all it takes is one person to do one silly thing, like throw a rock or break something, and you could trigger that critical point or that phase transition, and it can go from being a peaceful thing into a violent thing. And another thing that happens in those states is we sort of start to offload part of our thinking to the group collective. Right? Because everyone else is doing it, it's okay for us to do it. And there can be this sort of that justification, or you're not even thinking about it in terms of that. It's just monkey see, monkey do. And so all it takes then is, if we're all sharing a similar state or similar frequency, is for one person to do something, and then literally can have a chain reaction through the entire crowd, and everyone can start doing that. This phenomena there's many examples of people trying to exploit this. So there was a whole bunch of protests that happened in America around the time of the pandemic. And there were people that were driving out, delivering pallets of bricks with signs on them saying, "Throw me." And all sorts of crazy other shit, to try to turn these protests into violent protests. And part of that can be, groups of people can get together to do this, so they can blatantly label label that protest as being a violent one, even though that wasn't the intention, that wasn't how it meant to be, but they can create the space where it becomes violent, or they can feed that violence so that they can deliberately discredit what they're trying to do or the protest was about. It's a great way to undermine the meaning of a protest, is to sort of turn it into that violent thing. But yeah, to answer your question, why do they turn violent? Because when you get enough people together, all, sharing some sort of vibrational state or collective sort of, resonance, it only takes one to set that trigger off, and it can go, and it just goes, So there's an asymmetry there fundamentally.
Yeah, dude, that's a great point. I'm even thinking back to certain group settings that I've been a part of, especially if you are in a situation where a few people are meeting for the first time and you're creating groups, maybe like teamwork exercise or team building thing. I can't remember a specific example. However, you come into a group, let's say 7 people, and nobody knows anybody, right? The dynamic is set really early on. If you have 2 people that are friendly and they begin right away, oh hey, how are you? My name is Dan, and just bubbly and upbeat.
Break the ice.
Yeah. The whole group becomes that in an instant. If you take the initiative and you're bubbly and outgoing, and the whole group is that now, and you can continue that vibe throughout the majority of the day with that group, right? But if you start getting a couple people just talking shit, like why are we here, why are we doing this, or any sort of negative energy, and someone jumps on ship, now that whole situation can be negative, and it might be very difficult to try and get out of that negative situation. It might not be like, horrible, but it just won't be the happy-go-lucky experience that it could have been. And it just happens so quickly. And I feel like that happens in protests as well. Like you said, there's just a spark. Someone just threw a rock. Yo, I'm about to throw one too, man. I'm feeling energetic. Let's do this shit. Like, we're gonna make a change. And then suddenly everyone's attacking, and before you know it, there's guns going off, places are set on fire, and it's a war zone.
So that is such a good point. You've brought this up before. You gave a good example of you were in a group with people and they're all like, I'm going to bash that guy or something, and they're all like, going to do this. Now, if you replace that group with another group of people who aren't like that, that situation gets handled very differently. All right. And so nothing is inherently good or bad. It is what we make of it. And in any situation, you can choose to focus on negatives or you can choose to focus on positives. All right. And so what you just said about, you got 2 people that take the initiative to introduce themselves, to start being positive, it sets the tone. All right. It establishes a set point for how things can be. And you have the inverse of that. You have the negative people come in, or they don't talk and they're all sheepish and whatever. But then everyone's going to be like that as well. And it's sort of this weird sort of mimetic behavior that we all sort of have. We sort of adopt the median of whatever's happening around us, kind of thing, or even in some cases the extremes. But yeah, literally the exact same thing with the protest. The difference in the protest is when you've got large groups of people together sharing so much energy on that similar sort of oscillation or that resonant frequency that they're all sharing, all of that energy's got to go somewhere. Okay. And all it takes is for one bad actor, and it can all go to that bad direction. And it typically takes a few more good actors. Like, there's an asymmetry between the good and the bad there, or whatever you want to call it, where one bad thing can derail the entire thing, where not necessarily one good thing can derail it in a positive direction. It typically requires a bit more of it. But an example of the protest becoming violent is that all of that energy and that frustration and whatever else was there, that feeling and emotion, all of that care and everything else gets channeled into a destructive path, right? And sometimes that can be good, sometimes it can be bad. But like, what you would prefer, ideally with these protests, to prefer to happen is, instead of it going down the destructive path, you go down the constructive path, the creative path, the empowering path. Like, you want to create a space where positive change can actually happen. But I think also, when people feel as if that cannot happen, that positive change cannot happen, well, then they will resort to the violence. My sort of hypothesis on life is violence is a fundamental reality, right? Death and destruction, or creation and destruction, are fundamental to life. And if you cannot solve the problem through talking and words and the rest of those things, then violence is always the last resort. But you don't want to, ideally, you don't want to use it. It should only ever be a last resort. But I think, yeah, in those protests, it gets used, possibly too often. But who would really know?
Do you think what Elon Musk has done with Twitter is a step in the right direction in terms of freedom of speech?
Big time. Absolutely. Definitely. Him shining a light onto the things that have been hidden and, kept from public knowledge is a massive step in the right direction. Does that mean that it's, all sunshine and rainbows? Not at all. It's typically quite difficult. Periods of change aren't necessarily known for being comfortable. And, it's common to hear people like, well, he's causing all this drama. He's contributing to this misinformation and all this other stuff. Well, no, what he's trying to do is let information be free. Information wants to be free, I think. It wants to be out there. He's trying to promote that. And yeah, there's going to be growing pains with that. But yeah, I think he's taken a big positive step, a big step in a positive direction.
What was some of the new things that have gone on with the Twitter since he's taken over? Because I'll be honest, I'm not really up to date with. I heard that he allowed certain people back on. I believe one of them was Trump. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. What are some more recent changes that have been made? Because, like I said, I haven't been following it too much. I know that there's been information let out about Hunter Biden's laptop, for example.
Yeah. It's off. I don't know heaps. I don't follow it closely either. I just every now and then I'll allocate some time to reading about it. So the biggest thing I think is the Twitter files. So he essentially made public a whole bunch of internal emails back and forth between Twitter employees and between government employees and Twitter employees and between CIA and security officers and other people and Twitter, right? And how that they were deliberately constraining people's ability to express their opinions freely or speech freely. So they were deliberately constraining free speech, okay? Even though they claim to be, free speech absolutists, or they try to believe in free speech and push free speech, they really don't. They think that they're better and that they know more than everybody else, and so therefore they're right and everyone else is wrong, and that justifies their behavior. Not true. So the biggest thing he's done is shine a light on all that stuff. Okay, so we were able to see that, everyone, I was one of these people that, thought, if everything they're saying is true, but this is what I'm seeing and experiencing, well, I must be going crazy. And so it was nice to know that we weren't going crazy, that there was actually some, fuckery going on in the background. And it's just interesting to see how much of that was actually happening. So there was censorship. There was all of these other things happening on the platform for people who said different things to the mainstream narrative. And that's it, right? And that becomes really dangerous when you've got everyone believing the same narrative. You always need diversity of opinion and thought, right? It's the only way we can account for variation in life, right? If everyone thought the same thing, that would be incredibly dangerous, right? Because we could get hit or killed, or something could happen that none of us saw because none of us were looking because we all thought we were so right. So we need diversity. You can't know ahead of time everything. We cannot predict the future indefinitely. We're fallible. We are also computationally bounded. We have limited abilities to compute. We also don't have all the knowledge in the universe yet. So we can't know everything. So to think that you know or you have the perfect model is stupid. Right? No one has that. We're probably never going to have it. I would argue that we will never have it. By the time that we do have enough of that knowledge and information, we will cease to be beings the way that we are. We'll end up being the whole universe, and so it doesn't matter. It's the only way you can know, right? So, it's just you need diversity. Okay, even though it can be confronting and it can be wrong a lot of the time, you can't shut it off, right? You can't be selective with it. It's always got to be there. You need that diversity. But outside of that, Elon with Twitter, I think what he's doing is making changes for the better. So he's sort of pushing for individual publishers. So he's trying to make it that everybody can have access to producing content and sharing that content online to an audience of people. He's really pushing for that sort of citizen journalism, right? To encourage people to actually, report on the things that matter to them so that we can have a closer approximation to what's really happening. Because if we just rely on these sort of, I don't know how to describe, the big names in media, if we just rely on them, it's too easy to game them or for governments to buy them off or businesses to buy them off or people to pay for the narrative. So if we're all just listening to them or sucking from their teats, right, we're all drinking their Kool-Aid, it's very easy for them to poison the Kool-Aid and we all get, indoctrinated or we all get poisoned by the Kool-Aid. Whereas if we have many, many teats from different people, we can all choose to drink different Kool-Aids, so the chances of us getting a poison one is much lower, so to speak. I think that was a shit analogy, sorry.
No, I loved it, dude. That was hilarious. You mentioned that there was plants that people were, you said someone brought a pallet with a bunch of bricks and says, throw me, right?
Yeah.
To sort of get people to start throwing bricks. So is it possible, this is sort of a conspiracy theory, is it possible that the government benefits by putting in these sorts of plants into these protests to create violence in order to sanction new policies, new rules based on the violence that's occurring?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just, if you understand the game theory of it, you realize that that's a good excuse. Like if we can say that all protests end up being violent, well, then we can outlaw protests, and then no one can go against what we're saying, And it's not that any of these things are inherently evil either, it's not like, oh, big bad evil government kind of thing. It's not. It's they have an incentive, right, to be able to do what they think is right. And all the people in there, they always want to believe that that's right, but there's no guarantee that that is right. And so then by shutting off other people's ability to challenge it, we'll never be able to find out if it's really right. And that's the danger. And so they can use tactics like that. And it's not just governments, it's businesses can benefit from this. There's lots of different parties that could benefit from planting things or making protests turn violent more often than not, or, inciting violence and doing these kinds of things. Lots of people can benefit from this. Businesses can, it's not just the governments. But yes, that's absolutely a tactic that could be used. And this is why it's so tough in the modern age, because, you might see something online and be like, oh, look at these violent protesters, but you didn't see any of the lead up. And so we have to be, dispel our judgment or dispel that enough and just realize that all we ever see is a tiny sample of what really happens. And that none of us have an actual 100% accurate worldview or can know definitively what really happened. A good example of this, because people think that, there's a common saying that is seeing is believing. Okay. But I think we should do this. We should do an episode on optical illusions and auditory illusions. And we'll do, okay. But seeing is not believing, right? Seeing isn't seeing even. Seeing is actually your brain hallucinating something and projecting it. Like when you see, you don't actually see. It's a representation. Your brain projects a hologram so that you think you see it. That's what it really is. And so eyewitness testimony used to be a very, very, sought after, or it was a very highly, it was the word I'm looking for. It was a very solid form of evidence. If somebody saw somebody do something, that was considered a very high level of evidence. Like it was almost guaranteed that that's what they really did, right? In many cases, it was guaranteed that that's what happened. If someone saw someone do it, it had to have happened, okay? Robert Cialdini is a psychologist. He's got some amazing books, But he gives an example in one of his books where he says, where he goes over eyewitness testimony and how impressionable eyewitness testimonies can actually be. So you can get people to see things that they didn't actually see because it never happened, just by leading them with questions in a certain way. Okay? So eyewitness testimony is not valid at all, really. Okay? Because people will pretend to have seen stuff, or they'll make stuff up that didn't even happen just to agree with you or to disagree with you. There's so many nuances with this, right? So even when somebody says, oh, I saw this happen, even that is not 100% guaranteed. That kind of makes it, yet we see these snippets online and we go, oh, that happened.
That's wild. There was a documentary series that came out on Netflix a couple of years ago. Guy who got wrongfully accused for committing a murder. Actually, I don't remember if he got wrongfully accused, but it was a whole case about the potential of him being wrongfully convicted of this murder. And they showed a clip of this younger kid, maybe 13, 14 years old, doing an eyewitness testimony or testimony of some sort. And he's in the room being interrogated by two police officers, and they're just drilling him with questions, drilling him and drilling him. And it became evident, it just got to the point where the kid was willing to say anything just to get the hell out of that room.
Yeah.
So it became sort of this natural mechanism that switched on to survive, fight or flight, I suppose, which brought him to, you know what, yeah, this is what I saw, this is how it went down, which is all complete lie and fabricated, but it was allowing him to finally just end it, right?
Yeah. And so that's one mechanism, and there's a whole space of those things that exist. So it's not just one. There's like a whole space of things that can happen. People can lead you. You can want to just say whatever for the people to like you even, right? Like, how weird is that? Like, you might want someone to like you, and so then you say something that wasn't true. Or not even that, like even lower level in the brain where you're subconsciously thinking that these things happen. Like, you know, you're manifesting them subconsciously, and consciously you believe them to be true, but they aren't. Like, it's just crazy how like low quality eyewitness testimony is, and how like any one person's perception is easily, well, can be so fallible, but also easily changed and impressioned upon. Right? You can change it. You can change what somebody sees just by asking them different questions. Like, it's bonkers. There's a really famous example of this, which ties into racism and a whole bunch of other stuff. But there was, it was Denzel Washington played it in a movie. The boxer that got wrongfully accused. Oh my God, why am I blanking on this? Does that ring any bells to you?
Denzel Washington. If you
played him in a
movie, give me a hint, what was it about?
Boxing. He was a famous boxer, and he got done for the murder of people in a restaurant. And they got him because of an eyewitness testimony that said that they saw him and his car driving away from the scene.
Okay.
He got locked up in jail for like a mad long period of time. He ended up getting a pen pal, and he wrote back and forth to them. And then they finally got him acquitted because of like DNA or some other thing. But like, there's so many examples of this where people have just, you know, spent years and years of their lives locked up or behind bars for things that they didn't actually do because of this sort of bad eyewitness testimony or terrible evidence, really.
It's called The Hurricane.
That's the movie. Yes, that is one of the. It's a fantastic movie. Really good.
Yeah, I love Denzel. Every movie he's in is pretty much good. Like,
if you haven't seen that for a while, it'll pull the heartstrings.
I'll check it out. It sounds badass.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I like those types of movies.
So, okay, so with all of this, we've just got to be careful too. We have to understand that in the modern age, signaling is very cheap. Okay, and you can signal just because it looks like it is something doesn't mean it is, right? But we often just take what we see for granted. Okay, we see someone in a photo next to a $1 million car, we think, oh, that person owns that car. Maybe, Likely, they just saw it on the side of the street and they took a photo with it. Or in the modern age, they paid someone to allow them to take a picture with their car so they can look like they own the car. And there's a big difference between all of those things, okay? So signaling is really cheap in the modern age. And attention is a commodity, right? So human attention is a commodity. And we now know enough about humans and psychology and behavior and all of these other things to essentially hack us as people or game us. We can take advantage of traits that we've evolved to have, that we evolved to have because they were valuable to us in the environment that we were in. They help to keep us alive. Okay? Part of that's our limbic system or our fight or flight response. And now in the modern age, a lot of those concerns have disappeared. We don't have the same sort of problems, or we don't have the same threats that we used to have, like lions and tigers and predators and rival tribes and all this other stuff. So a lot of those have washed away or erode, like minimized over time. But we still have those same mechanisms that help to keep us alive back then. And big business governments have cottoned on to the fact that that's the case, especially media and social media as well. And they've figured out that if they hijack somebody's limbic system, they can get their attention for longer. And they can create a habitual loop that keeps them coming back to this thing, right? And so the way that they do that is by providing you with shocking, outrageous, divisive, horrible sorts of content that hijack the limbic system. They initiate the fight or flight kind of response, right? And they get you panicky, fiery, etc., to get your attention, to nail it in, to narrow it in on this thing, okay? And then it's very easy to think that this one thing is how everything else is, or that the whole world's burning because of this one thing, or any number of different examples like that, okay? And so it's really important to understand that that is the battle that's going on right now, is that people are fighting for your attention, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And no matter how much damage or harm is done in the meantime, as long as they get it, they win, so to speak. And so as humans, as people, as individuals, it's our responsibility to understand that that is the case and put measures in place that minimize their ability to hijack us, right? To take advantage of us. You want to become anti-fragile to these things. You want, the more that they try to do it, the more robust you become towards it. And part of that is simply just understanding that that is the goal of a large percentage of content that is put out online, onto televisions, on the radio, anywhere, is to be a bit divisive like that and to dumb down, right? To focus you in on something that's largely a distraction from what the real thing is, okay? And so we have to be critical in our thinking. We have to remind ourselves that none of us have a 100% accurate view of what's happening, okay? Whatever we're seeing is just a tiny fraction. Like it's so small in what's happening in the world, right? That it does not reflect the whole world, okay? It's only a tiny fraction, and it's likely being biased to try and get you to think about it in a certain way anyway. I think they're just some useful sort of heuristics or tools that we can remind ourselves of.
Very well said, Rubes. I think we'll call it there, bro.
Call it a pod. If you have any questions, if you're a listener or a reader or whatever, if you have any questions about these things, like specific strategies or what skills could you learn to minimize your people being able to hijack you, or if you are somebody that gets hijacked and you don't want to be as hijacked anymore, feel free to write in comments or share your story. If you used to be someone that got hijacked, but you no longer get hijacked as easily, and you've got some strategies, or you've got a success story, please share them. It not only will be interesting for us, but it could help other people as well. And again, any questions, or if you'd like tips on strategies, etc. I found some for myself because I used to get hijacked regularly. I used to get outraged all the time at all these different things. So I've found some useful strategies for myself. They may or may not be useful for you. But like and comment and let us know.
And stand up for freedom of speech, but do it in a peaceful way. Even
if you don't like what they're saying, right? That's the important thing. You got to be a free speech absolutist, even though it allows people to say shit that's ridiculous and like stupid and all those other things. It's still got to be allowed to be there. You've just got to know that the knowledge or good will prevail.
Right on, dude.
Peace.
All right. Love you, bro. Peace.
See you, guy. Peace.